Welcome back to Neal on Fire, where we talk with the people building the future of wildfire detection, mitigation, and response. Just a quick note for listeners. Neal on Fire is provided as a service to highlight wildfire innovation. I am not paid for this podcast. One of the most interesting wildfire detection research papers I've read recently did not come from a national lab. It didn't come from a major university. It came from a high school junior, and it makes a compelling case for using underground soil sensors to detect wildfires. I found her research on the Journal of Emerging Investigators website. I'm excited to have that researcher, Rhea Rawat, with us today. Welcome to the show, Rhea.
Thank you for inviting me to the podcast.
So, how did you first arrive at the idea that soil could be used for wildfire detection rather than focusing only on above-ground sensors?
So I first got into wildfire research when I was witnessing the devastating impacts of wildfires, especially in places like Hawaii and Greece. And in many of those cases, the most destructive fires weren't really detected early enough, and that kind of allowed them to grow out of control and cause a lot of damage. And at the same time, there's a lot of scarcity of firefighting resources, whether that's personnel or equipment or even access to water. And then I've seen this strain not only in Hawaii, but also in more recently in fires in places like Los Angeles, where multiple fires can overwhelm response systems. So as I dug deeper, I became more aware of these broader consequences. And I know that wildfires can contribute to about, I think, 20% of carbon dioxide emissions, and they cause long-lasting ecological damages affecting soil health and entire ecosystems. So with increased urbanization of once forested areas and also the effects of climate change, a lot of communities and homes are now directly in harm's way, and fires are becoming also more frequent and intense. So I started looking into existing detection solutions, things like satellite imagery, smoke sensors, and thermal cameras. And while many of these technologies are obviously impressive, a common issue stood out to me, and that was that they're all above ground and they all depend heavily on ambient conditions. So this makes them prone to false alarms, and in many cases, they're actually destroyed when a fire actually reaches them. So that gap really stood out to me. It felt like there was an opportunity to rethink wildfire detection from the ground up, literally. Subterranean soil-based sensors offered the potential for earlier and more reliable detection, as well as fewer false positives and systems that could actually survive a fire rather than being lost to it.
So, for people hearing this for the first time, what actually happens underground when a surface fire passes over the soil?
So in my experiments, I measured soil temperature and soil moisture at different depths under both normal conditions and also during a fire, under a controlled fire, of course. So under normal conditions, the soil was very stable. So this means that temperatures stayed very constant and moisture levels also didn't really fluctuate. However, when a fire started, I noticed some rapid and noticeable changes. So firstly, soil temperature increased very quickly, especially in shallow layers just below the surface, and it increased gradually in lower layers. So the temperature was spiking several degrees in just a few minutes. And I saw that soil moisture also changed. So as the soil heated, water near the surface began to move down to lower layers away from the heat source and then eventually evaporate, showing a sharp increase in readings before reducing.
So, you tested sensors at different depths. What did you learn about response time and reliability at shallower versus deeper depths?
So in my experiments, the sensor depth actually had a big impact on how quickly a fire was detected. So sensors that were placed closer to the surface, just a few inches below the soil, they registered rapid increases in temperature almost immediately when the fire started. But deeper sensors took longer to show changes, obviously because heat has to travel downward farther distance through the soil. So this kind of tells us that soil acts like a slow moving conductor of heat. The shallow layers feel the fire first, while deeper layers feel the warmth more gradually. And by placing sensors at multiple depths, I could track how quickly the fire's heat penetrates the ground, and eventually use that information to detect fires early and reliably before smoke or flames are even visible.
From your research, I recall that you used two sensor depths. What would
Yeah.
be the benefit of using more? Would that make sense in the experiments that you were doing?
So, there is no harm in using more sensors, but the thing is that we want to create a balance between accuracy and timeliness. So basically, in my experiments, the system could detect a fire anywhere from 10 to 17 minutes. That was with a 20% temperature increase at a 1 inch soil depth, and then a 30% increase at 3 inches of depth. Those were my after the fire started, those were my two thresholds. But basically, depending on the depth of the sensors and on the thresholds, you can detect the fire much earlier or later. This is what I mean by when I say that it's really the balance between accuracy, confidence, and the amount of time the system takes. So there isn't any problem per se like adding more sensors. It would definitely increase the reliability of the system, but you want to be careful because if you add too many sensors going deeper and deeper into the soil, you're also risking that the system will not call out a fire fast enough.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, talk to me a little bit about the technology you were using. I understand they were LoRaWAN-based sensors. Talk a little bit about the type of sensors, and in addition to moisture and temperature, was there anything else that you were able to, any other data that they provided?
So I used a DS18 B20 waterproof temperature sensors. It was important to me that they are waterproof because these sensors should obviously be able to withstand some pretty harsh conditions underground. And I also used a capacitive moisture sensor. So the LoRa that you mentioned earlier, that was for communication. Because this is a wireless sensor network, I needed the sensor nodes that are being placed at a variety of locations in a community or in a forest to be able to kind of talk to each other, to be able to send that soil moisture and temperature data to a base station node.
Do the soil sensors have an antenna that goes up to the soil level, or how is the information sent out wirelessly?
So the antenna is, I think it's approximately 3.22 inches. Basically, LoRa is a broadcaster. How I was able to, so what I did was that every sensor and also, so there's multiple sensor nodes, multiple sensors, but there's only one base station node. And this base station node has an address, and every single sensor node that is buried underground also has a specific address. So LoRa is it's obviously wireless, and it's broadcasting the soil temperature and the soil moisture that every single sensor node is collecting to the base station node. But it's sending it from that specific address, from that sensor node specific address to the base station node.
And how frequently was that information sent from the sensor?
It was about every 15 seconds, I'm pretty sure. Every 15 seconds.
So these must be battery operated. How long in practical use would you expect a battery to last in the soil sensor like this?
So with the battery that I specifically use, the thing with batteries that is that it could really be any amount of time. For me, the one I use, I'm pretty sure it would have lasted like a year, if I'm not wrong. However, like if this sort of system were to be like scaled up and like really deployed in a real community, you'd need a much stronger and larger power source.
That makes sense. So the challenge, though, is if there is a canopy fire that hasn't yet gotten to the ground, you're not going to be able to detect it. There would have to be other means, whether it be, gas sensors or satellite, whatever it may be, cameras, to be able to catch that could work in concert with your soil sensor. Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm obviously open. So My system is really focused on using those subterranean soil sensors to detect fire, but I'm obviously open to having other existing technologies like cameras, satellites, other like wildfire detection tools be integrated into this. It's just that the approach should be selective integration because like the key challenge is really finding the right balance between confidence and speed, as I mentioned before. You'd obviously want like a very high level of certainty before raising an alarm, but you also don't want to delay detection so long that the alert comes too late to be useful. So some above ground sensors like smoke or ambient temperature sensors, they're known to generate false alarms because they're heavily influenced by the ambient surrounding or like environmental conditions such as wind, dust, fog, or even like near human bite activity. So integrating those signals without careful weighting, it can actually reduce the effectiveness of the system rather than improving it. That's why I believe the approach should be selective integration because like sensors that add meaningful confirmation without significantly increasing false positives or detection time, it can strengthen the system. But anything that slows responses or introduces noises has to be carefully evaluated because in wildfire detection, a late or unreliable alarm can be very dangerous.
So true, but the question is during your research, what was your false positive rate?
So in my research, I all the experiments that I conducted were very accurate and I didn't have any false alarms or missed detections. And that kind of showed me that underground sensing is very accurate and very reliable.
That makes sense. But detection speed is everything in wildfire. How quickly were you able to detect wildfires in your tests? And what does that window mean in terms of practical terms?
So as I mentioned before, I was able to detect the fire in 10 to 17 minutes with those two thresholds I set with the 20% for the first sensor and a 30% temperature increase for the second sensor. But like playing around with these numbers is important because if you say that you want to increase the threshold for either of the sensors, you're going to probably increase the accuracy of your system, but then you're going to compromise your timeliness. You're going to sacrifice that valuable time that the system was using confirming that there was a fire when you could have like when the system could have already detected the fire much earlier.
So, your detection algorithm, as I understand it, focuses on short term changes rather than historical baselines. Why was that design choice important for this?
So focusing on short-term changes underground was important to me because in order to detect a fire, you need to be able to see rapid changes in soil temperature and soil moisture, which wouldn't have occurred otherwise if it weren't for a fire. So this allows the algorithm to compare the rapid temperature increases with the soil temperature with what soil temperature is historically in a given region. And it's not that long historical baselines aren't important. They are important because that's what the system is using to compare the current temperature that's just coming in when a fire has started to what is the like the normal. But really what the system is looking for is a very rapid increase in rate of change
Gotcha.
in temperature.
That makes sense. So, because these sensors are buried, they're protected, I would think, from flames and smoke. So, how important is system survivability when you think about doing real deployments of this technology?
Yeah, so because the sensors are buried, they are protected from direct flames and flying embers, but they still need to keep working after a fire passes. So in practice, that means that you need to design them to be very low maintenance and corrosion resistant. So system survivability is obviously very important when thinking about like scaling upwards and real deployment because we obviously don't want our system damaged after every single wildfire. And for long-term deployment, these systems would need to be extremely durable. Like they'd have to survive heat, moisture, freezing temperatures, and like physical stress from soil movement, animals, roots, like all while remaining accurate for years at a time. So that means that sealed, like waterproof housing, fire resistant materials, and components designed to handle like wide temperature swings would be very important for these sensors if we're thinking about a real deployment.
So you tested this in New Jersey. I'm curious what you think the impact of different soil composition might be around the world, or if they were more in soil that had more sand or loam or what have you. How do you think that would impact the readings from the system?
Yeah, so I've thought about this. Testing in New Jersey means I obviously don't have access to every single soil type. But the thing is that soil type does not really matter for this system because how the algorithm works is that the system is taking the reading that just came in and the soil temperature reading that just came in and it's comparing it with the running average of like the last five temperature readings. So basically, it's trying to compare the most recent reading with what the stable soil temperature is historically. So that would mean that the soil type wouldn't really matter because if the system is deployed in a certain region with a certain soil type, it already knows what the stable environment looks in that given area, and then it's able to find that rapid rate of change, that increase in rate of change of soil temperature by comparing it to what the system knows is the normal temperature.
So this seems to be a system that can provide one additional data point, which is really critical in wildfire detection, along with cameras, satellites, sensors, etc. How do you see all of that integrating together and kind of leveraging canopy fire information or other fire information that wouldn't be present from your readings from soil sensors?
So, like, other technologies can, of course, be integrated into the system. I do see that as like a possibility. However, you'd still have to consider like how these other technologies have false positive alarms and how like if you were to add them to the system, that could potentially like reduce the effectiveness of the system, which is why I mentioned earlier that selective integration.
So, if someone wanted to deploy this today, what do you think the biggest challenges they would have to think through before doing that?
If someone wanted to deploy this today, I feel like they'd have to consider like cost-effective hardware and reliable power, as well as strong communication infrastructure, because every single sensor needs to be inexpensive and durable and able to operate for long periods of time. And that could be like using either maybe solar power or like long life batteries, but they need to be able to survive in harsh outdoor environments. So I think that if a like a land manager, for example, wanted to deploy this, they'd have to think of smart deployment strategies. Like, for example, instead of covering every single square foot, sensors could be placed in more like high risk zones, such as near communities, for example, like or along high value properties. And when combined with wireless networks and centralized data processing, that makes large scale coverage very practical.
So, this is such a breakthrough in wildfire detection. And I've talked to lots of different innovators about the best way to go about picking up wildfires, and every technology has its place. I'm curious, what do you think in terms of coming research or future development steps that would move ground fire detection from experimental into operational use?
So I would focus on like large scale real world field tests rather than like controlled experiments. So I deploy soil based sensor networks across like high risk wildland, urban interface areas, or like urban interface areas where early detection would have like the greatest impact on protecting communities. But I'd also test how the system performs across different soil types, as we mentioned before. That wasn't something that I've done as yet. Vegetation and climate conditions, and how well that integrates with existing tools like emergency response systems. And also, just as importantly, I'd evaluate long term reliability like power usage, communication stability, maintenance needs, and false alarm rates over an entire fire season. So the goal would be to prove that the system not only works in theory, but it's also operationally effective at scale because right now, with these experiments that I have, it's really a proof of concept.
So let's talk about a proof of concept that's even bigger. So if somebody watching this or listening to this says, wow, I've got to try this. This looks amazing. Are you in a position to help guide them, give them suggestions around the technology and how to deploy it, how to collect the data and analyze it? Is that something that you'd be open to assisting with?
Yeah, sure. I can assist with that. When I was conducting my experiments, I only had one sensor network sending the data directly to my base station node. But if somebody wanted to have multiple sensor networks all sending data to base station node, I can definitely assist them on that in terms of like technology.
So, in terms of the mechanics of your research, what was you had the ground sensors, but what was the heat source, or how did you simulate the fire and be able to get the data? What was the modality that you used for that?
Yeah, so obviously I can't start a fire, but basically the heat source was I'd have like a lot of these pieces of coal and then those would be set on fire and it was very controlled. It was a controlled fire and I'd have the sensor node underneath the ground with the two sensors at 1 inch and 3 inches respectively in their positions already. And then I'd put that piece of grass or that land back on top of it. And then I'd put the coal that was just heated with fire right on top of that area. And that would be simulate like the heat source, the fire.
At any point, did your neighbors wonder why you were starting so many fires in your backyard?
No, our backyard is pretty big, so I don't think anyone really saw.
That's
Thank
great.
God.
So I understand beyond the research, which is amazing, that you've been granted patents associated with this. And so what did they cover? And more importantly, what are you going to do with them in the future?
So yes, the solution is already patented, and I think this provides a strong foundation for commercialization. So the patent specifically covers the use of the subterranean soil sensors to detect fire and to be able to autonomously mitigate it without waiting for central firefighting resources. So I think the next step would be to partner with like institutions such as research organizations, government agencies, utilities, or fire management authorities, which and they can help fund, validate, and like scale the technology.
Is this one of those scenarios where you skip college and just start a company and do soil sensor work?
No, I'm not actually fully sure um about like what I want to do in college. So I haven't like thought that much ahead, but just in terms of this specific research, I guess that this would be the next step.
So we've covered a lot today, so much that I didn't know about using soil sensors for wildfire detection. Is there anything important that we didn't get to? Do you think listeners should know?
One thing that I'd like to emphasize is the human and like community impact of this technology that I know I didn't really talk too much about before. At its core, I feel like it's not just about sensors and data. It's also about giving communities time and like agency to respond to wildfires before they become disasters. And I also want to highlight that while even though the technology is innovative, it's designed to be practical and deployable today. And the goal is to make wildfire management smarter and faster and safer, and ultimately to reduce the loss of lives, homes, and ecosystems in like a world where wildfire risk is only increasing.
Wow. This has been a great conversation about how soil sensors can be a key part of a wildfire detection strategy. Rhea, thanks again for joining me today. Your research is incredible. We're going to post a link to it with the show notes, and I encourage everybody to take a look at this. It's really, really interesting, and I think very relevant for what's going on around wildfire detection. It's another piece of the puzzle to help us detect wildfires as quickly as possible and avoid all of the damage associated with that. So if you found this conversation useful, please subscribe. And we look forward to seeing you again on Neal on Fire. Wherever you listen to podcasts, stay tuned for the next episode of Neal on Fire.